Hey folks, this is Cammie Westall with an overview of Chapter 13, which is entitled Manifest Destiny. And just to go ahead and give it kind of a definition to make sure that's clear with everyone, Manifest Destiny is this idea that American expansion was divinely ordained. America had been getting land pretty easily throughout the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, where we would have lost territory had it not ended and brought things back to the status quo. And so things kept falling into the hands of Americans, and so it seemed like God was on the side of the Americans, and we should just continue to move west and establish an American empire that extended from coast to coast. So it will get into some of this manifest destiny, but the chapter sort of begins on page 363 with the decline of Jacksonianism. Andrew Jackson, the prominent president, served 2 terms in office and retired, and his vice president, Martin Van Buren, then was elected in, as they say, on Jackson's coattails. Martin Van Buren becomes the 8th president, largely because he was associated with the successful presidency of Andrew Jackson. A few controversies in that presidency, but nevertheless, Van Buren will be sworn in. Random trivia point: Van Buren was the only president to grow up with a language other than English as his native tongue. He was from a Dutch family living in New York, or Dutch immigrants there, so he spoke Dutch as his initial language. But Van Buren, almost as soon as he's sworn in as the 8th president after winning the election in 1836, there's a problem. You have the Panic of 1837. This deals, as most economic situations do, with credit issues in specie, or the hard coinage, the amount of money available. And Van Buren definitely wasn't to blame for the start of this, but like Andrew Jackson, he took the viewpoint that it wasn't the role of government to manage the economy or manage currency or have a very hands-on position. So this it's very hard to read from this cartoon here, but this has been a similar situation to the recession of the past few years that was bad a couple of years ago in particular, where here's the dad out of work. He says, I have no money and cannot get any work. The kids are hungry. The wife says, I'll give up my food for the kids. And then here are the bankers saying, well, we need to collect the rent or we're going to close, just as a few years ago a lot of banks were closing because people couldn't pay their mortgages or pay their loans. So the banks are closing, those people are losing work, and you get a bad cycle. So this is what is associated with Martin Van Buren, and basically as soon as he's sworn into office, he's already assured of not winning re-election in 1840. So the Jackson days are coming to an end. The book then transitions to this role of manifest destiny in the antebellum meaning the pre-Civil War culture, and how, again, as I mentioned before, this expansion had seemed so easy. Painters like Thomas Cole painted landscape scenes that were inviting, that were adventurous, that showed Europeans or people of European descent being able to expand, have land that would yield bountiful crops, have independence, be out of the booming cities. So these independent farmers would be roused up from seeing images by painters of the Hudson River School, particularly Thomas Cole. So there's this desire to have the land, to move west, to have the adventure, to have the autonomy and the independence. And one of the first places America dealt with in regards to this was going to be Texas. So in 1830, all of this chunk of land belonged to Mexico. That's a bunch of states there belonged to Mexico. Mexico had gotten its independence from Spain in 1821. Mexico wanted to grow, and to do that, Mexico needed to ensure that its land was populated. So here's this province of Texas, so this Texas chunk, part of Mexico, and the Mexican government basically invites settlers, Americans predominantly, to move there, and they say, hey, if you agree to become Mexican citizens, to convert to the Catholic religion, then we will give you this land for free or for a very small cost. So that was a desired situation for many Americans. And guys like Stephen F. Austin moved down there, starting a colony. But eventually those people who speak English, who are living in this area far away from the Mexican capital, which would be way down here, more towards the S kind of here in claimed areas, they're living more independently. The Mexicans try to reel them in, and it will lead to a war, the Texas War for Independence. Texans, people living in Texas, they're no longer Americans, but the Texans will fight for their independence from Mexico. Mexico, led by General Santa Anna. So in this Texas War of Independence that occurs in 1835 and 1836, Texans are fighting to become an independent country, basically, against Santa Anna. This is where the famous Battle of the Alamo occurred in 1836. It's described a little bit on page 372. It's a battle that the Texans lost, but that phrase, remember the Alamo, there in San Antonio, became a very prominent message, because the numbers are given there, only 187 Texans fighting against about 2,000 or more of Santa Anna's army soldiers. So thousands of Mexicans, between 2,000 and 3,000, fighting against fewer than 200 Texans. And the Texans hold out for 13 days. For 13 days, despite being outnumbered by more than 10 to 1, the Texans hold on to the Alamo before they're all finally killed, led there by Davy Crockett, who was killed with them. And so the phrase "remember the Alamo" became inspiring to people like Sam Houston, and other people joined the Texas War of Independence to say, hey, look at how heroically these guys fought despite the odds. And yes, they lost, but they held out longer than anyone ever imagined. So let's remember the Alamo and let's fight. And Texas will end up gaining its independence. So Texas becomes its own republic for a little while. Then moves on to talk about the Oregon country and the Oregon Trail, leading people out to the Pacific coast. Lots of timber and lumber there. Dangerous journeys. Classic video, or not even video, computer game back on the old black and green computers that we used to have growing up. Talks about some of the Native Americans across the Mississippi River, how they're having to adapt, the role of bison, and how the risk of bison extinction wreaked havoc on their lives, but as they keep being relocated to other lands. Then moves back to politics, discusses the election of 1840, where William Henry Harrison becomes the 9th president, a man who had fought against Indians. Harrison runs as a Whig, the famous slogan "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," the log cabin and hard cider campaign. And Harrison wins the election largely because of the lack of popularity or lack of support for Van Buren. But Harrison is sworn in March 4th of 1841. And there's a problem. It's really cold that day. It's really wet that day in Washington, D.C. William Henry Harrison gives the longest inauguration speech in presidential history and gets pneumonia. And he dies a month later. So the shortest reigning president, William Henry Harrison, and so conveniently your book then quickly turns on page 380 to the presidency of John Tyler, who had been Harrison's vice president. And Tyler was, then it sort of goes back to Texas and Oregon a little bit. Tyler had been supportive of trying to add Texas as territory. So in 1845, here was our map where Texas was here, Congress was hesitant to add Texas because it would upset the balance of slave states and free states. Slavery talked about a little more in detail in Chapter 14. And so Tyler couldn't get it annexed easily. But Texas was down here. Here was all this disputed territory where Mexico said, no, that land belongs to us. And Texas said, no, we think it belongs to us. So there's this disputed territory. And that ends up prompting a war initiated by President Polk, James K. Polk, from North Carolina, who moved to Tennessee later. Polk became the 11th president. He's called a young Kickery. He reminded a lot of people of Andrew Jackson. But Polk really wanted expansion. He wanted the United States to go from sea to sea. At first he wanted California. Mexico refused to sell it. And so then what he does is he sends army troops to this disputed territory. He knows that's going to provoke an incident. And surely enough, when General Zachary Taylor is sent to this disputed territory where Mexico and Texas couldn't agree who owned this land, Mexicans retaliate. And they fire into the American soldiers. This is just what Polk needed. He can go before the American people then and say, we have a terrible problem. Mexico has invaded the United States. They've killed American soldiers. So that prompts the Mexican War, Mexican-American War. So that war goes on, and by the end of that war, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, so it's a short war, the United States gets all of this territory in gray and in pink. So Mexico loses over 50% of its land to the United States. It was a war where most of the American soldiers who served and died not from combat but from disease. But a war where once again this expansion seemed to overall just fall into the hands of Americans. So expansion continued, but there are going to be consequences largely revolving around slavery after this treaty gives us all of this land, and whether this land should permit slaves or not. And so the times of easily gaining land will help contribute to the falling apart of America. And that's a brief overview of Chapter 13.